program. Greetings and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much indeed for joining Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa, where we discuss pertinent and topical issues of peace and sustainability around the world and across Africa. Before introducing the topic and the speaker, let's observe a moment of silence to remember our brothers and sisters in Tanzania, Sudan, Nigeria, and elsewhere who have lost their lives while fighting for justice. So our theme today is Abandon Fear to Live by Love, Universal Law. And the speaker is Clive Menzies. Clive's experience encompasses a wide range of management positions within the financial services and technology sectors, augmented by his understanding of political economy and the universe. He has done a lot of research in this area and has also published quite significantly. And Menzies is joining us again. He was with us as a participant. And today it's a pleasure and honor having you, Clive, to speak to us. We are all ears, and I thank everybody for their time and interest in our program. So you are welcome to start, Clive. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much, George, and for the introduction. I ought to explain briefly that although I spent quite a lot of time in financial services, I did quite a lot of other things, including working on a building sites, driving minicabs. I had a furniture factory for a while. The reason I ended up in financial services, I found that there was very little money in making things. There was much more money in buying and selling things, and even more money in buying and selling money or things representing money. And in terms of my journey of discovery, I suppose it started in the late period of the last millennium, but really took off after 9/11, where I started to question narratives and what I had no reason to disbelieve hitherto. And over the following few years, I looked into the global financial crisis of 2008, and it became apparent to me working in the city that the response to that event was wholly inadequate and the criminals were still in charge. And the criminality of the banking system and the whole way we operate became evident. I also spent some time researching climate change, the hoax, the narrative to monetize carbon and basically continue to harvest the human cattle. And as a result of 9/11, I did quite a lot of investigation of the various wars and false flag attacks that have occurred over the last century and a half or so. But my learning, if you like, really took shape towards with the Occupy movement in 2011, started on Wall Street, followed in London in October 2011, and on the front of St. Paul's there was something called Tent City University, and I started to talk about some of the things I'd learned. And then a free university was established in a building that the Occupy movement occupied, which was a former UBS bank, and it was called the Bank of Ideas. And out of that grew the idea of a free university. And we were sitting round in a room on the floor in December 2011, and somebody said, well, we need to start some courses. So I volunteered to start a group to explore all these things that I'd researched. but it was on the basis of uh, collaborative learning rather than me standing up. And it started with me talking about things, but it became a much more dynamic, fluid process where different people would bring their perspectives to the table. So much of what I'm presenting today is not my work. It's my synthesis of all that I've learned from so many other wonderful people. Some of them not so wonderful because nothing is black and white, and we learn a lot from the people that we disagree with as well as those that we may agree with. So the subject of my talk today, and I'll conquer the technology and share my screen, which hopefully will work because I've made a few slides. Right, that's the one. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, I just want to check I can move the slides. Here I can. Okay, so the title of this talk is Abandon Fear to Live by Love and Universal Law. And throughout our research, after a very short period, 3 years or so, we understood the structural nature of how we're controlled through institutional hierarchy, theft of the commons, things that should belong to us all, the land, the air, the sea, the resources. We should all have access to those, and we are all stewards of those, but they've clearly been stolen or misappropriated. Excuse me. And the last floor, there were three floors: institutional hierarchy, theft of the commons, and what we described as usury at the time, i.e., interest on money. But our work subsequently, because we came to a point where we'd sort of gone as far as we could with critical thinking, and we had to look beyond that into the more spiritual and esoteric dimension, but also a few of us wanted to work on money much more closely. And that has really led us to this realization, a combination of those things, that money is the way we've organized ourselves for a very long time, and it runs completely counter to universal law. Universal law is based on love, love thy neighbor, love creation, love your creator. But money is diametrically makes it almost impossible to live by that maxim. People go to church or the mosque or the synagogue and partake in a spiritual ceremony. But when they're outside, they're having to deal with people as if they're strangers because there is no love in the world of commerce, for want of a better way of describing it. So we've looked at many sources over the years, but there are two books that in particular that we're currently focusing on. And this first one is it's called The Structure of World History by Kojin Karatani. And unlike he refers to Marx talking about modes of exchange. Um, sorry, but Marx didn't really address it. He moved on to modes of production. Whereas Karatani has done an excellent job of unpacking the evolution of our modes of exchange. So he talks initially about nomads who didn't have any need to exchange because they had so little. They would basically pool everything. But that was followed when people started to settle, that was followed by the reciprocity of the gift. So that people would give to others in the expectation that they would be given too. If it was a direct one-to-one exchange, it give some sense of obligation, and one could arguably say that that is not in line with universal law either, but we'll come on to that later. But then when kings and other organizations started to create a hierarchy, they provided power and protection. So the mode of exchange was used to pay taxes in order to be protected from all the various threats from outside, even the, if you like, illusory threats from outside. And in extremis, it becomes a protection racket where they create the threats and harvest the victims accordingly. We then move into the banking era of commodity exchange, where basically everything has a price, and that is determined by market forces rather than by the real value of what's of value to a human being. What is the value of motherhood? We put no price on that, for example. Um, and what Karatani talks about is the evolution from our current position to a transcendent form of operating. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we came to the view of coming up with an alternative way of organizing ourselves, but it's corroborated and reinforced forced to a great extent by what Karatani writes. He talks about the three essential pillars of the current system, which are interdependent. And if one collapses, they all collapse. He talks of capital, nation, and state. And he puts forward the idea that these are going to evaporate or dissipate to be replaced by a different way of organizing. So that is sort of, if you like, a very brief history about how we've got to where we are, with some flavor of what might be to come. So just to reinforce, if you like, the result of our current mode of exchange, this was something we came up with probably over a decade ago, which basically, whatever you call the cult that is pulling the levers of power or controlling the levers of power, essentially their position is structural. Um, and that is what makes life so difficult for us, or has done hitherto, that it's very difficult to change the structure from within. So the controlling clique, we call them the structural elite or the criminal clique. I now refer to them as the cult of destruction, for want of a better description. They control all the levers of power. So when people say Israel controls the US or vice versa, or this president is controlled by the bankers, or whatever it may be, this clique or cult controls everything. So the geopolitical narratives or stories that we're told via the media are just that. They're narratives to keep us distracted, divided, in conflict, fear, because that is the biggest lever that has been used against us for as long as any of us can remember, but certainly going back centuries. Fear is the way you rule in the current narrative, in the current system. Um, at the time that we produced this, ecocide was a buzzword. But basically, we are stewards of our environment, the planet, and we have a responsibility to it. And contrary to all the claims of sustainable development goals, which are an inversion of what they're really about, they're about colonizing or corralling all of the wild areas for the elite, and the rest of us being crammed into 15-minute cities. War is obviously a constant. It's now reached fever pitch. I think the world is in a state of madness, which is indicative of a seismic or epoch changing paradigm, where we're shifting from what has essentially been a paradigm of fear or division or conflict, whatever you like to call it, into a paradigm of love, in the sense that we will not be systemically incentivized to divide ourselves from each other. And I'll come on to that a bit later. Um, Basically, all of the wealth on the planet it belongs to us and is created by all of us. We're all codependent, we're interdependent, we create all this, but through this system of debt, taxes, rents, fines, charges, bureaucracy, all of that, most of what we commit in terms of resources and energy is sucked up the pyramid into the cult, um, and the cycle just repeats and repeats. But we have observed progressively over the last, I guess, since the invention of the printed microcircuit in the 70s, what we've seen is an alternative mode of organizing, which is gaining ground, for want of a better way of putting it. Um, this is actually a map from, or a picture from the technology sector, but it applies just as much to real life. But basically, you can either have a centralized state or world, which is what they're trying to achieve, which will obviously fail um, for reasons that are almost self-evident. They're in a position of overreach, and a growing proportion of the human cattle are realizing how much they've been lied to and abused by authority since birth and long before their ancestors. So that is changing. Um, we can progress to a decentralized model where you have, if you like, smaller centers of power, but they too will suffer the same disadvantage that those generally in a position of authority, their first priority is themselves rather than other people. Whereas in a distributed, codependent network, things are much more fluid. There is hierarchy in the sense that in any sort of activity or a discussion, someone may well take the lead because they're an authority or they have skills in a particular direction, but they won't be necessarily the same person that will lead in a different discussion or set of circumstances. So we came up with an acronym called which comes up as DAXO, which is Distributed Autonomous Codependent Self-Organization. And I don't really want to speak for too long because I'd like to leave a lot of time for Q&A, but there are copious references as to what all these things mean and how they operate and what the empirical evidence is for the claims that we make, for want of a better way of putting it. Um, so I'm just following my thread as I go through. So what this distributed network has done through the internet, and I think most of us wouldn't be in the state of awareness or knowledge that we have today without the internet. So in effect, what we're doing is we're socializing our problems and socializing the solutions to those problems. Admittedly, the large companies such as Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Google, they are clearly harvesting a great deal of value out of our data. But nonetheless, in the process, we are becoming much more aware, and there are more distributed modes of communication that, independent of those, or even within those, that are beginning to create a very different dynamic. And just to address one point that is often argued, that they have control of AI, they have control of all this technology, but the reality is that in order for them to compete in the marketplace of AI and development of intelligent systems, communicating systems, blockchain, whatever it may be, they're becoming becoming constrained by energy resources. If you try to centralize these things, it requires an infinite amount of energy which cannot be provided. And so they're having to distribute more and more of the processing and the storage of data locally. And all of us are carrying around phones and we have PCs and what have you. So the distribution of the network is already taking place. It's being forced by technological process and commercial necessity as much as anything. So as much as they'd like to centralize, everything is becoming decentralized. And this all came from the open source movement. Um, the phones, the technology we're using today via the internet, our smartphones, all of this stuff didn't come about from a corporate blueprint, but it came about from people having problems, solving them for themselves, sharing the solutions, and then sharing those, improving on those shared solutions dynamically. And this has created what is arguably one of the most technologically challenging accomplishments of human existence, the internet and the internet all it's provided. So if you think about the Industrial Revolution, which lasted some 200 years, you could reckon that our ability to produce things increased by a magnitude of, say, 100 times, 200 times. What has happened in the last few years with the advent of the microchip, increasing miniaturization, all of the tools and methods that have emerged from this technology, we can now process information at a rate billions or millions or possibly even billions of times what we used to be able to. Excuse me. So this slide is primarily summarizing the attributes or the underlying tools available to us and methods to be able to live and organize in a very different way, which is essentially what we're saying. This is happening almost irrespective of what we do. And a lot of people I've had conversations with say, well, when is this going to materialize? How am I going to pay my rates bill or my electricity? And my response is that it's a largely attitudinal change where rather than trying to make as much money as possible, which is the default position of our current mode of organization, you try to do with as little as possible and you stop feeding the death and destruction. So you don't pay taxes, you don't pay charges, you don't pay utilities. And there are ways of lawfully not doing these things because these things have imposed through a legal system which is not about justice, it's about commerce. We are corporations in a system of commerce. And once we realize that and step away from that, then we begin to suck the life out of the current structure, which is in its death throes. And that's why things are so crazy at the moment. For a new paradigm to emerge, for new life to emerge, there has to be death and destruction. And that's one of the inevitable, but obviously unfortunate consequences of what we're going through, this transition. So I mentioned the acronym, which is listed here. I've got a reference at the end of the slides as to where you can find that. So, excuse me. Another book that we've looked at, because a lot of the way we organize ourselves is to do with the way we think. And another book that we've come across is The Master and His Emissary. And this is to do with the way we think about things. And it's crudely left brain and right brain, but it's much more complex than that. But in essence, we've been conditioned over the years to distrust our intuition, our sort of creative side on the right brain, and focus primarily on logic, inductive logic, and the sort of narrow focus, linear focus of whatever we may be thinking about at any given time. But the two should live in harmony. And the problem with our thinking, particularly in the Western world, is that our left brain, which should be an emissary of the right brain, for want of a better way of putting it, has become the dominant force and has basically sidelined our right brain and creativity into another commercial enterprise, which, you know, is a whole separate discussion, which I won't go into. So these things, it is quite complex in some respects, but it is also very simple, that money creates fear and division. If we have a system that enables us to live without those constraints, then we live by love. One of the things that we've talked about, my friend Alex and I, particularly, who work with something called the Digital Currency Global Initiative, which was a project run under the International Telecommunications Union and Stanford University, was exploring digital currencies, and in particular digital central bank digital currencies. And our contention is accepting that it's unlikely to happen because of the power structure and the way the levers of control are under the cult. But arguably, people within central banks may be able to recognize that they could actually create a central bank digital currency as a transition mechanism or bridge to the new future. As I say, it's probably unlikely, certainly in the established central banks of Western Europe and America, but maybe, and we've talked to or we've been talking to central banks like SAMA, the Saudi American Monetary Authority, or countries in Africa, Burkina Faso, who are under the jackboot of French domination. They don't have control of their own currency, and yet they have gold and other resources. So we have had some discussions. So it is possible, but the more likely source of this bridge to the future is likely to come from the open source movement itself, which makes being able to live in the way that I've described far more accessible to more people. And as it becomes more accessible to more people, the power of that network will resonate sufficiently that anyone outside it who's suffering under the current regime will say, well, you know, why am I still stuck in this system when over there those people seem to be thriving on the basis of codependence, self-organization, having autonomy and freedom that I could only dream about. So although it's taken us a long time to get to this point, I did get the sense when the COVID psychological operation hit that they'd overreached themselves, the cult, and that things were going to unravel. And I think what we've seen this year is a lot of these narratives unraveling as more and more people become aware of the toxicity and lethality of vaccines, for example, and the financial scam, which was the PPE, the masks, and all the rest of it, and all the nonsense social distancing, all of those things. People are awakening to the way in which they've just been manipulated and behaviorally managed. So I think in many senses, where if one could ever pick a point of transition, and one can only tell in retrospect, certainly this year seems to me to feel like the apex of change, that we cannot go back to what they've been trying to achieve. They're going to, the economic system will collapse and they'll try to finesse it. But my sense is that they will fail for many, many reasons. The idea that one system can rule us all, given the track record of large IT projects and the like, I just don't see that it's feasible. And a lot of people have fear of artificial intelligence. It'll take over the world and they'll control it. But consciousness is not data. We are spiritual beings. And however powerful AI is, it doesn't have that spiritual essence, which gives us access to infinite power of universal consciousness, God, Allah, whatever you like to call your creator, if you like, or the creation. Um, excuse me. One of the things that is quite difficult for people to come to terms with is this feeling of identity. The whole system, particularly in the last 50 years, has become one's identity has become a sort of mode of living that is totally divisive. In extremis, it is violent. This quote I came across years ago, and it always struck me to have resonance, because whilst I can see the strength in or the wisdom at the core of things like Christianity, Islam, all the other religions have this inner core, but because they're operating within this organizational paradigm that we have today, they become divisive and violent. So essentially, when we talk about creating, we have the methods to create what is in essence a global family. In a family, you don't issue a bill after a meal. Basically, everybody in the family has needs and capacities, and they have strengths and weaknesses. And you know that somebody's not very good in this area, or maybe a little untrustworthy in that area. But you have the capacity to understand. Maybe some people say 60, could be up to 150 people within a tribe, that you could have that sort of relationship where money is wholly unnecessary. Everybody is looked after. The problem arose, and the reason that money was adopted was that when you went outside the tribe, how do you have that that unique understanding of every individual that you're dealing with? It's impossible. But we now have the tools and methods that I talked about earlier to be able to interact with anyone anywhere in the world on the basis of having access to all the knowledge that is relevant to that particular relationship or transaction. So in effect, we no longer need to be tribal in the sense, and I'm not dismissing tribal culture, because I think that's very powerful. It's innate to us. It's fundamental to our being. I'm not saying we should reject our sense of being, if you like, within a certain tribe or ethnicity or whatever it may be. But we should move beyond that in terms of recognizing that we are all related. We are all spiritual beings. We're all part of the same consciousness. And we just need to recognize that fact in order to, if you like, flourish as a species. I just realized that slide isn't in the middle, but whether it will move, I don't know. Oh yeah. So this is this is not a diatribe against religion or anything. It's just that religions evolve, hierarchies and institutional hierarchies bring a lot of disadvantages in terms of the way we organize ourselves. So I'm not going to go too much further. There's a lot more that I could talk about, but there's a lot of what I've packed in. But essentially, what I'm saying is that rather than fear being our dominant default emotion, you're hit with social media every day, or if you watch TV, which I don't, you're hit with this imagery which invokes fear of the future, fear of whatever. When you let yourself go and know that the universe will look after you, and if you look after everybody else, you'll be looked after, then you're operating in a sphere of love, which has nothing to do with the current structure, and you're then rejecting, or if you like, you're starving the beast, the structure, of energy. And in terms of the individuals who may be involved in the hierarchy, perpetrating crimes, whatever they may be, I realized a long time ago that we are all part of the problem as long as we feed the system. So arguably we're all guilty, and it's not our job, in my view, from what I've learned, to judge others. There is a far bigger authority that will take care of that. But what we do need to do is recognize that every action that we take to support the structure is killing a baby in Gaza or causing problems in Tanzania or wherever it may be, because this is what the machine feeds off. It feeds off our energy and resources. And if we withdraw those, then the possibility of a world of love becomes real. And rather than slip the slide. So I mentioned a few references. I didn't mention Douglas Reed, The Controversy of Zion, but I've read many references relating to the cult, and arguably it has its roots in one of the 12 tribes of Israel, but certainly doesn't pertain to all Jews. There may be within the cult black nobility, various other forces. But that's not really relevant. The who is not relevant. It's the how, and how do we get out of this, and what can we create as an alternative. And the alternative that we create is how we live naturally. We just have to extend that using the tools available. So I've spoken for, I didn't want to do more than 40 minutes, and I think I've done under that. So I'd be happy to answer any questions and maybe expand on some areas. And some of you may have some contributions that will help others understand from a different perspective what I'm talking about. So thank you for your time. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to put forward the ideas that I and my colleagues have sort of accumulated over the years. And I couldn't name them all. It must run to thousands. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Clive, for this wonderful presentation. And I would like now to ask people here on this call to ask questions, make comments, exchange experiences. And you've touched upon a number of very, very important issues. And I can't even attempt to summarize them, but you know, you've said, for example, that you've got these three things: capital, nation, and state, that depend on each other. And of course, if you remove one, then everything else, you know, collapses. And you, of course, have mentioned this criminal ruling clique. And I think this is probably a mantra everywhere. And you've talked about the levers of power, mentioning war, ecocide, oppression, division, etc. And we've talked about this move now from this, or the distinction between centralized, decentralized, and distributed networks, and many, many other things, but also very important quotes that I can also recall. We are spiritual beings, or we are all part of the problem. So when, for example, if I'll be the first one to ask, between, you said, nation and state, how do you differentiate the two? Or is there, for some people, these are one and the same? Thanks. You are muted, Clive.
Yeah. Don't let this man loose on technology. Well, I think it is quite important to differentiate between the nation and the state, because certainly if you take Britain is somewhere I know best, I suppose. But and I'm not really talking about the current epoch, because the whole system is, to me, is just disintegrating and crazy. But if I think about Queen Elizabeth's reign, she represented the state, which was ostensibly a ceremonial role. We know that there's a much deeper story where the monarchy is very much embroiled in the clique, but at least there was this appearance of a nation state. So patriotism associated with the flag, king and country, relating back to the two world wars. I mean, they're all illusions in this, insofar as the narratives are inverted, which I won't go into. But there is this sense of nationhood. But the state is, if you like, the mechanism by which the cattle are harvested. So, in some senses, the sense of nation is a sort of symbolic, emotional embrace that you have for your sense of being, and then using that as a sort of very effective lever. The state itself is a system of harvesting the human cattle through taxes, imposing all sorts of charges here, there, and everywhere, managing behavior, all of the things that we've experienced over the last, well, since 2001, although long before that, but egregiously since 2001, surveillance, being searched, flying on an airplane when I was young was a real pleasure. I think it's like being treated as cattle basically these days, and I don't like to fly. I love flying. I learned to fly when I was 17, but I don't like to fly these days because it's such a traumatic experience before you get on an airplane. So the state is really the mechanism which harvests the cattle, and capital, if you like, is the means by which that whole thing is lubricated and made to run efficiently. And the state is self-reinforcing in the same way that debt is self-reinforcing. Debt has to constantly grow in order for the system to work, and it gets to a point where it's grown so big, cannot be sustained, the whole thing collapses. Well, bureaucracy is not different. Basically, bureaucracy is self-perpetuating and self-protecting until such time as the whole thing collapses on itself because it seemed to be inefficient. And arguably, and I don't want to get into the minutiae of the geopolitical or political unfolding of the last few decades, but arguably the reason why Thatcherism and Reaganomics took hold was that the sort of bureaucratic nightmare of socialist type policies had become more and more unworkable, if you like. I would argue the same sort of bureaucracy is becoming unworkable today and is falling apart.
Yeah, thank you so much indeed. Ali, you are welcome.
Thank you so much, George, and let me thank our very inspiring speaker, Clive, for this good presentation. I love two statements which he said, that is, we failed the system so that it can be able to drive the fear and uncertainty. I will be more than happy if we could explain by maybe giving one classical case. Then my other second question is, has science been used to create fear or to remove fear? Thank you so much, moderator.
Ali, could you just clarify your first question? I didn't quite understand the full extent of it.
Thank you. I love the statement where you said that the people who are in power or people who come with a system, a contemporary, they failed the system. So I was looking at it, because if you fail the system, then all the problems comes in. And the problem will never be solved if one fail the system. That is, I wanted you to maybe highlight slightly more than this. Because if I just give a Quranic example, human being fear two major problems. Number one is hunger, and because it affects individually, emotionally, psychologically, and it reduces the human dignity. The second thing that human beings fear is always war or conflicts. So I was requesting if you can just give an example of how we failed the system and for what reason. Thank you so much.
When you say we fail the system, you mean undermine it?
Well, the undermining is one, but those who come with this system, the intention is never absolute, let's say, service giving, but it's like they want to use it to manipulate so that people can fear. Thank you.
Okay. I guess the fundamental fear that most people have is fear of death. And that has become increasingly a problem or evident since the severance from our spiritual connection. There's been a war on religion for a long time, particularly in the UK. And severance from our spiritual being gives rise to fear of death. I mean, I could die tomorrow. I've had a brilliant life as far as I'm concerned. And I know that whatever comes next is an evolution to something better. And so I have no fear of death. But if you've been severed from your spiritual connection, then death is a visceral fear. And obviously war involves an extreme risk of death. Hunger is something that is wholly unnecessary in today's world, and it is systemically flawed in the way that we've evolved to feed ourselves. Most of what is produced and put on supermarket shelves, if it's food, it's been adulterated with unnatural substances, and a lot of it increasingly is not food fit for humans. And essentially, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have access to foods, say in Britain, that we wouldn't have had access to without trade, commerce, internationally importing food from elsewhere. But there's been a fundamental drive to reduce the ability for communities, countries, nations, regions to be self-sufficient. There's been a war on food for a long, long time, and it's just got worse. If you're a farmer, you've been under attack for a long time. And essentially it comes back to this idea of distributed, autonomous, codependent self-organization, because we can create our own food networks within urban environments. It's being done, although the authorities are attempting to curtail that. In this country, they've come up with an idea. They want to license every chicken. So if you keep a couple of chickens, but people are beginning to understand that when you register something, if essentially you're handing ownership over to the state or the registering authority. Anyway, people started registering frozen chickens and all sorts of things. The thing is, there's a lot of fear that stems from intention. They say they're going to start World War III. They're going to limit our ability to buy anything without a central bank digital currency. A lot of these things are stated objectives. Many of them, they don't even believe themselves they can achieve. But often, even if they can achieve them, it's our willing acceptance of the inevitability of what they're saying that could make it happen. We manifest our own reality. If you live by fear, then that's what you will manifest. If you live by love, then that is what you manifest. So, as I was saying earlier, it has to be attitudinal. You have to realize that you are a sovereign, powerful, we're all sovereign, powerful beings. We are connected to an infinite source of power. We just need to relax and let go and do what is right in our hearts. You know, I think a few years ago I decided I'd cease to worry about money. And, you know, I don't have much money. But I have enough to live on, and I live within a community where I don't need a lot of money to live on. So it's, you know, everybody's different. I started by abandoning loyalty cards, credit cards, and not paying for things that I didn't think were essential. And when the COVID narrative hit, I knew what they were planning because of all the research we'd done. One knew that the thing was a total hoax, not least because they in the UK government downgraded coronavirus as a high consequence infectious disease on the 19th of March. 4 days later, they locked the population down. So I knew it was a scam, and I decided to go to war, and I stopped paying banks, rents, council tax, utilities, and started laying out their crimes and learning about the legal process. So it's a progressive unfolding of understanding reinforced by practice that actually benefits you when you realize that you can live without money, and I don't live completely without money, but when you can do with less and less and less, then you're less plugged into the system, you're less responsible, and you're certainly less vulnerable. You know that I'm a relatively small fish in a very big pond. And, you know, if they wanted to come after me because of what I do, so be it. But I don't have fear of that because the love and the power that I feel around me from all the people that I interact with just makes my life blissful in a way. So for me to say that, I'm in a very privileged position. I don't currently live in a war zone, although I think they're trying to create war zones everywhere. And, you know, if I was in Gaza or in Tanzania or in Sudan or, you know, any of these places, Ukraine, which has been decimated by this ideology, I'm sure I would find it very difficult to feel as comfortable as I do now. But nonetheless, I think it is that process of realizing what our reality is and understanding that the system is not serving us in any way at all to our benefit, and relying on our neighbor. Who is our neighbor? Everyone. Yeah, there are people you may not click with, and you know, but that doesn't matter. You don't need to have relationships with 7 billion people, but you will find your tribe, and your tribe won't necessarily be the same ethnicity, nationality, color, sex, whatever. You will find your tribe.
Thank you so much indeed, Clive and Ali. Janet, you're welcome.
Thank you, George. Thank you for your presentation, Clive. Very interesting. As a development out of Occupy Wall Street, which was, you know, I'm in New York, so that was very important to see how people just came together and built community, got, you know, set up a bicycle to fuel the electricity, to run a kitchen where they could give away food and give away books, etc., until the police moved in and cleaned it out. I'm wondering how you I think you're talking about a spirit of generosity, which is there's no price on that. That we all have the ability to give to one another and to receive and to look out for each other, which is a could have been or has been a tradition in family, in tribe, in neighborhood, in, you know, various kinds of communities. And so could you say more about your community and how you support each other and you're supported by it? Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Janet. I've just realized that I've just looked down at my note and I realized I ignored half of Ali's question, which was about science. And with your permission, I'll just briefly talk about science. Because, yeah, science, I was listening to a podcast of Rupert Sheldrake this morning, who has some interesting ideas about the brain and where we think and how much we transmit morphic resonance. And he was saying, I'm a great supporter of science if it's done properly. We wrote a paper, we put it out in 2019 called Gulag Academia. And basically the way that academia has been controlled is quite a long, complex story involving the Rockefellers, Carnegies, the separation of subjects to ensure that people couldn't put the whole picture together. But science and scientism and the sort of eugenics movement and all of the technocracy is basically part of this severance of our spiritual connection from the severance of our spiritual connection to the universe. And scientism evolved through the late 18th and 19th century and really began to take hard shape in terms of its desire to colonize thought, for want of a better way of putting it. So to become an alternative religion, scientism, that, if it couldn't be proved, then it wasn't real. But anyone who has a spiritual understanding realizes that you cannot prove these things. You have to be open to them, and then you enjoy the benefits of them. So in terms of science, I think we've relied a lot on a lot of academics who've produced some very good work, but the peer review process, the scientific method is not being adhered to. I think it was James Corbett talked about a couple of researchers who decided to submit a load of papers into the academic establishment with completely nonsensical foundations. And they had to stop doing it because they found they were getting published. All you have to do to get something published is mention a climate change dimension or, some sort of reference to climate change, and you're in there, irrespective of what you're actually putting forward. So I think science has become pretty much corrupted as almost every other institution. So getting back to Janet, yeah, my experience has evolved over the years. I mean, arguably Occupy was led from the outset. It may have been a CIA IOP, PSYOP, I don't know. Certainly my experience within London was that the narrative seemed to be tightly controlled. They didn't like me questioning or talking about climate facts because it seemed to get taken over by the climate movement fairly quickly. But leaving that aside, the reason that I continued and basically devoted my life to this work without earning money from it is that I met some amazing people within Occupy, generosity of spirit, many of whom I'm still in touch with or working with in one way or another. And it's like a family. I have a family now that extends to, I have no idea how many people, but they are people that I love who, if I go traveling and I need to stay somewhere, they'll feed me, they'll look after me. I try to reciprocate and it's very often refused. I just find the more I give out, the more I get back. So it seems to me a no-brainer that, why would I be selfish? It would only harm me. But selfishness is born of fear of tomorrow. Will I have enough? Will I have enough for next week? Oh, perhaps, the parable of the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, to me, isn't a miracle in the sense that somehow all this food multiplied, which is what I thought when I was a kid, when I first learned about it. But it was creating a dynamic in the multitude where everybody shared what they had, and they had more than sufficient. And that's the reality of our existence. There's enough food in the world. All we have to do is find a way of organizing to ensure that it's shared freely rather than rationed and abused and polluted and poisoned by the current mode of organization.
Thank you so much. And there is also a question here in chat from Odoch Pido. He's saying this is a thought-provoking presentation. I wonder if it is possible to dismiss fear, and what is life without fear?
Yeah.
John.
Oh,
Excuse
yes,
me.
Odoch.
Can I just add one more?
Sorry?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I wanted to modify. I wonder if it is possible or even necessary to dismiss fear. So
Right.
just that. Thank you.
Well, we have very few threats where I am at the moment. Unlike many parts of the world, we don't have any real predators or threats to our existence. Fear. This is ego. Without an ego, we can't survive. In terms of fear, it may be rational to fear an immediate threat. But if you think about the way in which the media operates, the way in which the environment in which we live, you are being bombarded constantly by imagery, sound, sensory perception in some cases, with images and ideas to make you fearful. So I quite often travel into London to see a lot of my family, my expanded family, and work with them and spend time with them. And if you travel on the public network, tube, railway, buses, not so much on buses, but you will see signage to the same effect. You get this constant refrain. If you see something that doesn't look right, text or phone, blah, de blah, and then 3 words, see it, say it, sorted. And it's this constant idea that, you're under threat the whole time when you're in public, that is reinforced. So this sense of fear may be rational in very rare circumstances, but to live in an environment of fear the whole time clearly is very bad for us. I mean, moving sort of one step away from that. When the COVID narrative hit, one of the books I came across was by a pair of researchers called Dawn Lester and David Parker, and it was called What Really Makes You Ill. And there are 4 things that make you ill. The first is toxins. The second is poor nutrition. The third is electromagnetic frequencies, because we're beings of vibration. And the last one is prolonged emotional stress. Now, what have we been under since 2001? Prolonged emotional stress. Excuse me. That is clearly an unhealthy environment in which to operate. So fear, yes, has a place. Adrenaline has a place. It makes you achieve things that you probably couldn't achieve otherwise. But these should be sort of momentary, spasmodic events rather than a perpetual state, which is the state that many people live in. They live in a perpetual state of fear.
Thank you.
Right? Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just looking for other questions in chat, but just feel free to ask. Yeah, Peter, you're welcome.
Oh, thank you. I've had a few notes here. For example, maybe you could speak on some things like Varoufakis, his idea of techno-feudalism. I have a book by a friend of mine called Levers of Power, which you mentioned, which speaks to disinvestment as a major weapon of this struggle. And let's see, also I put something in the chat, a previous presenter named Kern Stroken is an anthropologist who, you could screenshot this if you like, an anthropologist who started out in rural Tanzania in his career as an anthropologist and has come up with a vocabulary that includes the concept of simplification. And the analogy to that for me is in your spine, there are ganglia which allow you to walk without having to control every little muscle. That's a simplification. But socially, we simplicate everything so that we get stuck in these patterns. Just a few things. I really want to spend several years in conversation with you.
Thank you, Peter.
I put my email in the chat for that purpose, and I hope you'll get in touch.
Okay, well, as Roger knows, a few of us do get together and talk about these things on a regular basis, so I'll let you know. I'll just mention Varoufakis, because it was around in the midst of our research when we deconstructed all this, and Varoufakis was the sort of rock star economist being bandied about. I mean, basically, he sold his countrymen down the river in spite of what he said. That's not to say he's all bad. He said some interesting things. Techno-feudalism, yeah, that's what they want, you know. We know this. Technocracy, there's a researcher called Peter Wood, I think, who's done a huge amount on technocracy. He's all over the internet. I'm sure you can find him. So yeah, techno-feudalism is what they're after. But for reasons that I've sort of alluded to, not in great depth, they're not going to achieve it. The idea, I mean, I've worked, amongst other things, I've worked in technology for a long time. I taught myself Linux administration about 25 years ago. And I designed investment management systems in the 80s and 90s. And I understand quite a lot about, I'm not in any way a geek or an expert, but my observation from looking at failed projects, looking at projects that I've had to rescue and put together, you know, the idea that you can create this one world government based on a centralized computer system is crazy. And as I showed in the slides, you know, this idea of a distributed network is being forced upon the organizations that are running AI. Because if you want to compete, the most effective way to compete is to give as much power to the AI to gather its own information from as many different sources as possible. I mean, I'll tell you a bit about AI as I understand it. And as I say, I'm not an expert. But most of what we're experiencing at the moment in terms of AI is large language models. So basically, you ask ChatGPT a question, it'll go off onto the internet, and you know, at its point of inception, it was probably given some sort of indication as to which sources it should be suspicious of and which it should rely on. And then basically it synthesizes it down into an average, and averages don't mean much. However, having interacted with AI for quite some time, talking about the sort of work that we're doing on money and organization and value, I had a curious incident a few months ago where I'd been describing this distributed autonomous codependent organization, self-organization, DAXO, and it actually came back to me with exactly the same words, even though I hadn't given it the words at the time, but in previous conversations. So AI is actually learning, and as it becomes more distributed, then it gets closer to reality because people will be interacting on the basis of their own reality. But a bit like the internet in general, you know, there's more information that is incorrect probably than is correct in the internet. So you need some sort of methodology to be able to make a coherent story or narrative out of it. But if AI is good at anything, it's logic. And the thing about lies is that they are logically inconsistent. If you tell one lie, you have to create other lies to support it, and they become logically inconsistent, particularly if inconvenient facts emerge. So as they become more logically inconsistent, then AI, if it's of any competence at all, will work out the illogicality of what's being proposed and dismiss it accordingly. There are, I mean, AI is developing so quickly, you know, whatever I say today is probably 6 months old. But there's a new idea of agentic AI, because currently, if you take your output from ChatGPT, having researched something, you go and then act on it. Well, agentic AI is actually much more modular, where it can perform specific tasks, and that will be integrated into an AI cluster, if you like, where different elements have different functionality, which is going to make it behave more efficiently, if you like. So instead of having to research AI and then act on its behalf, it'll do it all for you. But AI is a tool. It's like any other tool. You can use a hammer to kill someone, or you can build a house with it. And AI is such a tool. And I don't have a fear, particularly of techno-feudalism. It's what they want, but for reasons that are quite complex, the whole system's collapsing. So I don't see that as any particular threat over and above any other. Disinvestment of as a strategy, I think is more of a tactical weapon within the current environment. But given that in the future that we see evolving, money has no object. So yes, disinvest, but then where do you put the money? You know, sooner or later, all money will revert to being worthless, whether it's crypto, gold, dollars, euro, whatever. And when that does, then the money has served its purpose. But yeah, I would say that tactical disinvestment. But where do you start? I mean, there are so many. The obvious ones are the weapons manufacturers and all the rest of it. But that hasn't changed anything.
Well,
Most of the
by the
founders.
way, that's the point of this book, is that the disinvestment is on the part of the investor class, without which, according to my mentor, my late mentor, Howard Richards, our daily bread depends utterly on satisfying investors.
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, that's the structure as is. That's why we've got this evolutionary cul-de-sac of electric cars and that are actually running on conventional power and all the
Well,
other nonsense.
and I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I think right in there, the genocide economy now employs millions of people in every congressional district in America. And disinvestment simply means that's a nice warehouse for Amazon. You got a shame if something happened to it. Vote this way. There's no congressperson or judge who can withstand that.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah,
thank you
well,
so much. I want to put in the name Evelyn Lindner as well. Janet can speak about her, but her thesis is basically that it all comes down to human dignity. And I think that we need all of these vocabularies, and you are really on the right track, sir.
thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Evelyn, you are welcome.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you had mentioned in passing that either was the approach to or something related to COVID was a hoax. And I was wondering if you could unpack that relative to what you are proposing.
Right. Just repeat the first bit. I got COVID.
Oh, you've got COVID? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I
I mean, basically, COVID was a psyop. So, what are you asking?
Sorry. And first of all, I'm so sorry that you do have COVID. I you had mentioned in passing that either it was the response to COVID, something related to COVID, you called a hoax.
Oh, right.
And I was wondering
The,
if you
the overreach.
that in relation to what you're proposing.
Okay.
I.e. the alternative, if you considered something a hoax, what would have been the alternative?
Right. Okay. The coronavirus, I think you have to go back. I mentioned this book, What Really Makes You Ill. What Dawn Lester and David Parker did was go back through all they spent 10 years going through all the scientific literature relating to viruses and germs and could find no empirical substantiated evidence of either causing disease. And there are other researchers, Stephen Lanka, who put up a prize of 100,000 euros if somebody could isolate the measles virus. Somebody claimed it went to court, and the claim was thrown out. So what COVID was, and we put a paper out, which I'll send to George and he can pass it on. We called it a Trojan rather than a virus. And you know what a Trojan horse is, that in computing terms, a Trojan isn't a virus itself. It facilitates all sorts of other things like backdoor entry into systems and what have you. So basically, the COVID narrative was to play on fear. What made people ill in those circumstances were probably a combination of biological weapons, electromagnetic warfare, environmental warfare, in terms of what they spray, what people were, what is in their food, etc., and other things. But the whole a lot of the deaths that occurred because of the hospital protocols. One of my good friends and member of my family nearly died in a COVID ward where they ventilated him and tried to give him all sorts of dubious drugs. They were killing the old in England using midazolam and remdesivir. Basically, the healthcare industry is a sickness and disability industry. It's not a healthcare industry. It's not about keeping you healthy. It's about harvesting the human cattle. The PCR tests, according to Kerry Mullis, who died not long after it all started, who invented the PCR test, said it should never have been used for diagnostic purposes. You could find anything you wanted to find in a PCR test. It just depended on the number of cycles you put it through. So that, and arguably, some of the contamination that people suffered could well have been from the tests or the masks or other things that cause respiratory diseases. I mean, what was claimed was an acute respiratory disease. Well, one of the worst things you can do is keep recycling your own CO2 with a mask on, which wasn't going to stop any so-called virus, because any virus would have been such a size as to pass through those face masks in the main. So it's a complex narrative, but essentially I know a lot of people who've, if you like, awoken to the reality of their existence and the criminality of their government, actually get vaccinated to keep their job, to go on holiday, what have you. And many of those that I've spoken to regret it. I still know of people who continue to take vaccines, which I find almost incredible given the number of sudden deaths. And, you know, we now know that the sudden infant death syndrome was caused by medicine, not parents being willfully neglectful or even abusive to their children. I mean, there are just so many ills that have come out of the medical industry, and yet I had personal experience during this time where the love of my life spent 3 months in critical care, and I had to navigate this nonsense of I didn't wear a mask and almost came to a Mexican standoff with staff and authority. But as I said on the day Maggie died, I said to one of the nurses, I said, this hospital and you people are some of the most wonderful human beings, but you're working in a hugely toxic environment. And she agreed with me. You know, they know what's been going on inside hospitals. There was so much misinformation that was put out, and so much abuse and murder, which continues today. You know, there's a war on us all. They're trying to reduce the population. And I think, you know, that's the first understanding that one comes to when you look at the way in which the world operates.
Yeah, thank you so much, Clive, for that answer. And I'm looking for more questions. We have about 7 minutes. But this has been a wonderful presentation with a lot of knowledge that...
To interrupt you, John. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Hi, Clive. Nice to see you, and thank you very much for your talk. I found your work probably less than 2 weeks ago, and I've been consuming as much as I can of the stuff that I found on the internet. A friend of mine of Hayes Reviews, he put me in contact with this Zoom call today. So I'm really happy to be here, and I really appreciate the information you've given out. And I'm very sorry for your loss of Maggie. Just wanted to say that. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about the human economy and this idea of us fulfilling each other's needs, of having this need to contribute and living in this state of love, and how we can actually start to dismantle this hierarchical system, as you call it, institutional hierarchy. That's the word you use. And my question is this. So I'm in a position where, you know, I'm pretty much at the point where it's about time to go to war, as you put it. So as you decided to go to war about 5 years ago, in retrospect, what would you do differently?
That's always a difficult question for me because, you know, I've been in the belly of the beast. I was an investment banker, thought I was very important, had access to a company car and a chauffeur car and expensive lunches and so I've been there. Do I regret having been there? No, I don't one bit because I wouldn't know what I know today without having been through that experience. In terms of my going to war, yes, I made mistakes, um, but it was all part of my learning. Um, and I know it's a bit cliche to say je ne regrette rien, but I don't. What would I have done differently? I'm not sure I would have done anything differently. I mean, there was a serious standoff with the rest of Maggie's family when I went head to head with the hospital over the nonsense. And what somebody said to me within the family, why don't you just play the game? Because he was clearly concerned about the effect of the care for Maggie in that situation. And as I said to him, it's very easy to fight the system when there's nothing at stake or very little at stake. It's important to do it when everything's at stake. And I guess my assumption was that Maggie would be fully supportive of me, even though she was rather confused and disconnected on occasions from what was really going on. I mean, I knew she was still there. She was still Maggie. But in terms of her loss, in the immediate aftermath, and probably for at least a year afterwards, 18 months, maybe longer, it's now 2.5 years. Probably until January this year, I was of the view that I could never be happy again. I could be, I could be okay. And I had my beautiful expanding family who loved and looked after me. And in that sense, I could be happy. But I never felt I could be intrinsically happy. And I think I am now, not least because of my spiritual connection to Maggie and everything beyond. So, yeah, I miss her dreadfully in the physical and sensory sense, but she's with me all the time. She's laughing at me when I'm doing stuff and winding me up on occasions, hiding stuff from me. So, you know, no, I don't think I'd do anything differently, which may sound complacent and self-satisfied, but it's the way I feel.
Thanks, Clive. Yeah. So I'm wondering about communities and how to have some friends I've met recently, and we're working together on a project which is going to be a self-development center, an idea where we can have a hybrid type of situation where we can help people who are suffering, because there's a lot of people, especially younger generations, who have this almost innate anxiety, depression, which is all brought on through the technocracy and the screen addiction and all these hijacked dopamine reward pathways, which is ubiquitous at the moment. And we're looking at a way of bringing people into a natural surrounding so they can heal, because, as you said, quoting Dawn and Lester's book, that really it's the terrain which is what makes people ill. So if we can bring people into a healthy terrain, and then we mean that physically in a very beautiful place, then we can help them to heal on their own. And we're looking at a way to hybridize this system so that we can operate within the cult, so to speak, using their slave coins, and slowly begin to build this human economy from within. I'll be completely honest, it's quite overwhelming at the moment, because forging ahead into the unknown is kind of a bit scary. So really, if you had any advice on this project. That I really appreciate that.
Well, I think in the space time available, I probably can't go into much depth, but I'm very happy for you to contact me offline and we can talk about it. In broad terms, the universe will provide. And I know that sounds strange, but what's happened to me over the last few years, even before Maggie took ill, is the universe provides. It will present things to you. You just need to. Do you know Eckhart Tolle?
I haven't met him personally, but I do know him. Yeah.
The Power of Now.
Yeah.
I mean, I find that quite powerful. I mean, it's one of many, many sources that has led me to this view that if you let go and relax, as long as you're pure in intention, then the opportunities will present themselves for you to move forward. But as I say, I'm happy to talk to you in more sort of concrete terms offline.
Yeah, I'd really appreciate that, Clive. How would I get in contact with you?
Have you been on outersite.org?
No, I haven't.
Oh, right. Outersite.org is my main blog site.
Okay.
outersite.org. Outer site. You can send me an email in the first instance, and I'll respond, and we can talk or whatever.
Thank you very much, Clive.
That goes for anyone.
James,
sorry, George.
Yeah, you're welcome, James. Nice to see you.
I was just going to say something that gives me strength is a bit of a fridge magnet wisdom I saw once, which was everything will be all right in the end. If it's not all right, it's not the end.
Quite right.
Yeah, cool. Peter, would you like to say something?
Well, thank you. Taking more than my share here. But one of our late friends, Howard Richards, wrote extensively on the fact that understanding that it's structural and systemic really helps with the anger. And so, it keeps us from attacking each other for something that is structural.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
I live by
yeah, please go ahead, Clive.
There are a couple of mottos, one of which I put the slide up for, which is live by love, take what you need and leave the rest. Or take what we need and leave the rest. The other one is quite personal in terms of the way I embrace it, which is patience, acceptance, and forgiveness. And those are hard things. So when you think about all the perpetrators within the cult, how do you forgive them? And I think as Peter, I think it was Peter said, when it's structural, it's easier to forgive. And I think that's true. And in my experience, a lot of people who are, if you like, up the hierarchy, and I've met a few, they firmly believe that they're doing good. They have a conviction, they have a story, a narrative that makes them comfortable with what they're doing. Like Madeleine Albright, when asked whether 500,000 Iraqi children were a price worth paying, and she said yes, it was. I mean, I don't know in what narrative that works, but clearly she believed it. That's probably an extreme example. But, a lot of people in the hierarchy aren't necessarily evil, although I think there's deep evil within the hierarchy itself, and there's some pretty strange satanic stuff that goes on. But yeah, we can rise above that. We don't need to give it our energy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Clive, for your excellent talk, for being with us. You've given us very many excellent mottos and, yeah, food for thought, for sure. And we are looking forward to having you again. This is our community, and as you can see, we are learning from one another. We are learning from your wisdom, and so please do join us whenever you have time. We meet every Wednesday, and apologies for those especially in the US and Canada, that the daylight, saving. I just thought about Europe. I think maybe Google, I asked it the wrong question. So it was like, okay, the US will change later. Anyway, we are here together. So I hope next time everything will be fine. Yeah. Thank you so much, Clive, and all the best to you. And bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Richard.